inevitable.
Welcome to the channel, I'm Hayes. I talk movies all day, so subscribe right now if you want to be entertained. And today, I want to talk about what makes a great villain. The guys you love to hate, or maybe hate to love. Now, I am going to try and avoid major plot points and things like that, but I am going to be saying some stuff about various shows and movies, so spoilers. Alright, so to start off with, I want to talk about a few standout villains of recent-ish years, because the TLDR answer to what makes a great villain is Giancarlo Esposito. Giancarlo Esposito makes a great villain. Every time I've seen this dude play a bad guy, he knocks it out the park. Every time. Recently, I saw him in Captain America Brave New World as Sidewinder, knocked it out the park. As Stan Edgar in The Boys, knocked it out the park. Moff Gideon, Faraday, Anton Castillo, knocked it out the park. And oh, I think I can hear you now. Don't worry, I ain't forgotten. We gotta talk about Gus Fring. Cause you know what made Gus Fring one of the best bad guys for me? Was the fact that he was actually pretty kind to his staff at Los Pollos Hermanos. Like that one kid when those gangsters showed up and he was all like, "You want me to stay with you?" Bro, you clearly have no idea who your boss is, right? Gus Fring, the guy who would slice your throat without a second thought. But to this kid, he's the sweet old boss that may need some backup, which technically is true. But if you had even an inkling of who Gus Fring is, you would have quit that job before the show even started. You see, we see both sides of Gus, but the staff don't. We see how violent he can be, and we also see how he can smile in the face of people he don't like so he can get what he wants. And anybody who's ever had a job can relate to that. Hopefully, that's all you can relate to. Because Gus Fring is very possibly a psychopath. He's patient, intelligent, ruthless when he needs to be, calm when he needs to be. He very rarely has emotional outbursts. So you know when he killed Victor in front of Walter and Jesse, that wasn't some spur of the moment thing. That was purposeful. But let me talk now about my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe villain, Erik Killmonger. Now there's a lot of reasons I like Killmonger, but probably the biggest reason is that at no point does he ever do anything outside of his own self-interests. Well, maybe a little bit, but certainly not to the point where he's just blatantly leaving himself open. From siding with Claw so he can get close enough to kill him, to killing his own girlfriend when she became an obstacle. When he became king of Wakanda, he burnt all the heart-shaped herbs so no one else can have the Panther powers. Everything he did was to ensure his own success. Also, another thing about Killmonger, he was right. The Wakandans did keep vibranium to themselves when they could have been helping people around the world. Matter of fact, not only did they keep it to themselves, they devised a ruse so that the rest of the world thinks they're a nation of farmers. They let countless people suffer while they flourished and pretended to have less than the people who were actually suffering. Matter of fact, it was King T'Chaka's actions that led to N'Jadaka becoming Killmonger. Now, whether or not T'Chaka was justified in killing his own brother N'Jobu, I'll leave that for the courts to decide. But there is no way you can tell me it is ever a good idea to leave a freshly killed dead body in the same apartment that you killed him in. Are you dumb? So now you have a child seeing his dead dad, then learning about his true heritage and how they've ignored the woes of the world, ignored the struggles of the diaspora, ignored the other African nations when the Europeans started to get too greedy. Killmonger is going through all of that as a kid, cut off from his immediate and extended family, which makes him not only relatable but also understandable, and underneath it all you can see he's still just a hurt and angry child. The only thing that really makes him a bad guy is he's kinda sociopathic, but that ain't even his fault. How many times do you find yourself truly not knowing whether you should cheer for the hero or the villain? And I think you'd be hard pressed trying to find a bad guy whose dying words hit harder than this.
Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
Okay, so I've talked about a possible psychopath and a possible sociopath. Now let's talk about someone who could possibly be a little bit of both. The Penguin, specifically the Penguin played by Colin Farrell in the Matt Reeves Batverse. Although, by the way, Burgess Meredith's Penguin was smart enough to get all the other super criminals to follow his lead, so he ain't no slouch. And, side note, Frank Gorshin's Riddler is still the best stressed villain of all time, fight me. And, side note, Adam West was the greatest Batman ever, no cap. Still, to this day, the only Batman to ever beat up a shark. But anyway, Colin Farrell's version of the Penguin was just evil. He was cold, manipulative, cruel, and just evil. Plus, this guy has absolutely no redeemable qualities. There was for a bit where I thought he might have some redeemable qualities, but something happened. I won't say what, but suffice to say, this man has no redeemable qualities. He was just evil. But my favorite thing about the Penguin is when they show parts of his childhood and you fully realize that he is just like that. Like, nothing made him that way. He is just like that. You know, he didn't have an abusive mother. Though, to be fair, she definitely coulda and perhaps shoulda done something.
Just look at the flowers, Lizzie.
You know what I mean? And to be fair, we don't know what his relationship or lack thereof with his father was like, but we do see his mother trying her best. 3 kids, single parent, giving them all love and attention. She was trying her best. And to be more fair, his mother did eventually encourage his bad behavior, but the point is she didn't cause it. He was just like that. And that stands out to me because it feels like in recent times there's been a trend of complex bad guys. Guys who you sympathize with or understand their plight. And I like that. I like that there is a complexity where these villains exist in the gray area. But sometimes you really just need the bad guy to be a bad guy for no other reason than he's a bad guy. And also, another thing that I think makes the Penguin compelling is he is this guy that starts at the bottom of this crime organization. He was looked down on, nobody thought much of him, and on top of that, he's got a bad leg and can't walk properly. He is the underdog, and a lot of us have been the underdog at some point in our lives, so you kind of want to root for him as a man starts at the bottom against all odds, working his way up. But in the end, he is just so damn evil. So what is it that makes a great villain? Is it their relatability, or how much you can sympathize with their struggle, or just how cruel they are? Let's take a little history trip, because when I was but a wee lad, one of my favorite shows was ThunderCats, where the main bad guy was and at the time, Mum-Ra was a scary dude. He was this decrepit old wizard that can transform into this big, muscly monster thing. I don't even know, but this dude was scary. And Mum-Ra was no pushover. He'd be taking Lion-O and the ThunderCats to their limits. There were bare times I was watching the show like, no, how are they gonna get out of this? Now bear in mind, I'm like 6 or 7 when I first watched the ThunderCats. So at that time, I'm not really noticing, certainly not to the point of fully registering all the BS they pulled on that show. Mum-Ra wasn't some badass, scary monster thing. The amount of times the ThunderCats only won because one of the bad guys did some stupidness that ruined the whole plan, or Mum-Ra basically just defeated himself by being way too much in his own ego and constantly underestimating the ThunderCats. Though, that said, if memory serves, which, to be fair, bit of a stretch, it was a long time ago, but there were at least a few times where the ThunderCats had to actually overcome the bad guys. Just a few. And also, bit of a tangent, but thinking back on the ThunderCats, I'm like, wait a minute, Mum-Ra was there first. Man was just chilling in his catacomb, minding his own business, then these guys showed up talking about, oh, we're gonna live here now. Nah, they're illegal immigrants. They just built a whole cat lair on somebody else's land and don't pay no taxes. They enforced their own Thunderian laws, but didn't even check to see what the Third Earth laws are. I'm just saying, Mum-Ra wasn't a nice person, sure, but actually, the ThunderCats started it. Anyway, parts of how we perceive the villain is to do with timing. Mumra was amazing back in 1985 when the pre-teens had a 1985 mentality. Back then, Mumra, Skeletor, Venger, these were some of the baddest mofos low down around town. And if you got that reference, put it in the comments. But now, none of that works. If they did Mumra now in 2025 the exact same way as they did in the 80s, kids today would probably see him as every bit the joke of a villain that he actually is. You're telling me this mighty, ancient, evil sorcerer can't just cast a spell to poison the ThunderCats? That show could have been like one episode. Max. Villains today have to be more intelligent, intricate, more layered because the scary but goofy villain has literally been done before, many times, which leads me to Thanos. Because Thanos, at least to my mind, hadn't been done before. I mean, yeah, I know he was in the comics, but taking a villain and introducing him in small amounts, building it up to their eventual arrival over multiple movies over an 11-year period, I don't think that's been done before. So whether you knew about Thanos from the comics or not, you knew he was a big deal. And by the time he does show up, he does not disappoint. Thanos didn't just make half of all living creatures in the known universe disappear in the movies, but also managed to divide half the people in the world on whether or not he was right. Now, Thanos was interesting to me because most villains generally don't see themselves as the villain, but Thanos perhaps even more so does not see himself as the villain. He truly believes he is saving the universe. Furthermore, he doesn't really even want to snap half of everyone away, but he fully believes it's the only way and it has to be done, and the hardest choices require the strongest wills. So this isn't someone who is lusting after power or dominance or any kind of personal gain. When it's done, he doesn't even seize the opportunity to take control of the galaxy. He just retreats to a quiet spot to live out his days. Matter of fact, he doesn't even keep the Infinity Stones. That doesn't sound like a typical villain. Also, just like Killmonger, Thanos wasn't wrong. If the issue is resource scarcity, eliminating half of everyone does solve that problem. Though that said, he could have also wished for twice as much resources. That could have also solved the problem. Or just wished everyone was less greedy and more considerate. I don't think anyone would have opposed that. But anyway, what they did was effectively create a villain that isn't really quite actually a villain. He had noble intentions, and perhaps had someone suggested a better option, he might have gone with that. Also, by the way, bit of a tangent, but after the snap was reversed, did the Avengers really save us? Or did they just doom us to our own greed? Because yeah, Thanos' methods were unorthodox, but the Avengers aren't really offering an alternative solution. So maybe the Avengers weren't so good after all. Just saying. Alright, so before I wrap this up, let me just throw out some names of some other notable bad guys across different media. Alpha, the Walking Dead, cold, twisted, demented, deranged, cruel. Honestly, if any character needs a spin-off series, it's Alpha. Ganon/Ganondorf, The Legend of Zelda, The Ocarina of Time, which, by the way, is the greatest video game ever made, not even an opinion. And that final boss battle where you're surrounded by fire, for me, that's one of the most epic moments in gaming history. Speaking of gaming, can't forget about Sephiroth, Final Fantasy VII, a tragic soul who possibly could have had a much different life if he hadn't been manipulated so much. Duo, the Duolingo owl, I don't care, that guy gotta be the most notorious gangster right now. How you gonna keep telling me I got it wrong when you don't even specify if you want the formal or the informal answer? Make it make sense. Art the Clown, Terrifier, disgusting, horrible, sickening. He's a delight, isn't he? Also, you know how people sometimes be acting different in certain situations? But obviously, Art's just saw right through them. Speaking of clowns, of course, the Joker, the Dark Knight. This guy was a master of deception, and in the end, even though he gets caught, he actually wins. And lastly, Annie Wilkes' Misery. Probably the scariest villain that I've mentioned today, because out of all the villains I've talked about in this video, you know she's the one that exists in real life. For real, if you got a child that calls himself a stan of one of these big social media influencers, Alright, so when it comes to what makes a great villain, the answer really is a lot of things. There's no one way to do it. For me, some of the villains I like are the ones that get you thinking or create conversations around society and how we treat and view people. In particular, people far less privileged than ourselves. These villains have layers, depth, history and motivation. And maybe I'm getting a little bit cynical in my old age, but more often than not, I do find myself siding with the villain. I mean, I'm not saying they're right for what they're doing. I'm just saying, I understand. And even bad guys who are bad guys for no other reason than they are just bad guys can still have their depths and layers and complexities as well. Though to be fair, not usually as immediately obvious. Truth is, whichever way the villain is done, just do it well. I think one of the worst things that can be done is when there is no real direction or just super inconsistent, or have them doing things that are so blatant and obviously stupid. Like almost every villain's gonna do something stupid at some point, but can you not be blatant and obvious about it? But since this video isn't about the worst villains, let me just leave that there. When it comes down to it, I do think the villain is always going to be one of the most important characters in a story, perhaps even more so than the hero, since the villain exists specifically to challenge the hero, and growth doesn't happen without friction, without being tested and pushed beyond what you thought you can do. So if you ever watch a movie and think, wow, that's an amazing hero, just know that the hero is only as good as the villain they overcome. But that's what I think makes a great villain. What do you think makes a great villain? Let me know down below, and while you're there, be sure to like, subscribe, and drop a suggestion if you don't mind.